A little while ago, I was lucky enough to be part of a very lively conversation about risk with a group of wonderful contractors. We had just watched a short video of Kenny the alligator wrestler. He had been doing his show for many years without incident, which concluded with him putting his head inside a huge alligator's mouth as the grand finale. Something you should know about alligators is that even a grain of sand can cause their mouths to snap shut. One fateful day, Kenny forgot to wipe the right side of his face before the finale, causing a bead of sweat falling on its tongue to trigger the alligator's mouth to snap closed. With over 2,000 psi, or 140 kilograms per square centimeter of pressure on his head, Kenny was seriously injured and was lucky to survive. The question was put to the room, whose fault was this? Some of the comments were, management, why would they even allow him to do that? Or his supervisors, why didn't they make sure he wiped his face or had someone wipe his face before he put his head in there? Or why would he put his head inside there? It's his own fault if he's taking stupid risks like this. He is responsible for his own actions and safety. I asked the room what exactly would prevent them from putting their own head inside the mouth. The consensus was that it was just too risky. The overwhelming opinion was that it was his own fault for putting himself in this high-risk position, that surely no normal person in their right mind would ever do this. However, if you really think about it, that's not entirely true. We do indeed put ourselves in a lot of risky positions every single day, in our personal lives and at work, without really giving it a second thought. It has become a normal part of our daily lives, a routine. We incrementally rationalize that this specific risk is something we are willing to take. We get into our cars every day, climb up on ladders, go skiing down a mountain, eat that dodgy sandwich in the back of the fridge. Is the reason you wouldn't put your own head inside an animal's mouth truly because it's such an outrageous, blatant disregard of the risk it poses, or is it something else? What if I told you before you had to put your head in there, we would attach a metal brace inside the alligator's mouth? So even if it tried to close it, it couldn't. Tested, 100% safe for up to 5,000 psi, guaranteed never to fail. Most of the room felt like, well, if it's 100% safe and I would know for sure it would never be able to close its mouth, maybe. Is it about the act of putting your life at risk? Or is it really about the lack of control, the fail-safe? We do get into our cars every day because we think they're safe. There are airbags, seat belts, driving rules most of us adhere to. If you get into an accident, there is a good chance you're protected. You are up on a 10-foot ladder. You have fall protection, working from heights training, maybe even a spotter. If you fall, you're protected. This is what should go through your mind at a job site, both as a supervisor as well as a frontline worker. For the activity I'm doing right now, what is the worst that could happen, and how can I fail safely? There's a lot of documentation we have to fill out that goes with keeping us safe, helping us to think and evaluate before we execute. More documentation does not mean we are safer. What truly keeps us safe is building the capacity to fail safely into our tasks. People do make mistakes. We are not perfect. So stepping away from operator-dependent safety systems, where workers are put into a position in which the only control there is against failure is expecting them to execute perfectly, should be your number one priority. This is where critical controls come in. They are the top most important controls that either prevent an incident or reduce the consequence when mistakes are made. They are what protect workers from serious injury or death. And with that, I would like to introduce you to my colleague Jawad, who's our expert on risk and critical control.
I'd like to maybe start by thinking about our personal lives a little bit. Let's think about somebody that we love, somebody that we care about, somebody that trusts us. Then, let's shift our focus on our professional lives. Think about A high-risk task, something that, if not done correctly, could lead to a serious injury or a fatality. Something that you may have done in your past or do right now, something that you may supervise, or something that you manage. Now imagine you've been given a role to create a perfect procedure to manage this high-risk task. You have all the resources in the world to create this perfect procedure. Some things that you're going to start thinking about is, what are the different variations I want to put in? What are the different factors I want to include? How long it should be, right? Now let's go back to our loved one. How comfortable are we going to be asking them to do this high-risk task by handing them this perfect procedure and walking away and knowing that they can do this safely? I think many of us would start to feel uncomfortable about this. I know I would. The point is, having a perfect procedure is very difficult, if not impossible. There's just too many factors to consider. As we get deeper into this talk, what I want you to walk away with is three things: major accident hazards, critical controls, and assurance on those critical controls. Three things. So with that, I'm Jawad Rashid. I'm with Suncor. I lead the enterprise operational risk management process for the organization. And we manage these three things on a daily basis. Let's start with some statistics. We have fatalities in the construction industry, about 20 for every 100,000 workers. From year to year, the trends change. From 2021 to 2022, we had a 50% increase. Not a trend we want to continue to follow. But the biggest shock to me when I was preparing this was that in the last 20 years, our trend and our statistics, our rate of fatalities has not really changed. That to me is shocking. We have risk professionals, we have safety professionals, we have full departments in our organizations that manage safety and risk. We talk a lot about them, so they're top of mind, but we continue to see incidents. We continue to see fatalities. So something has to change. There's a saying that is attributed to Einstein, but in my research it's not really him, but it says, sanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So we got to change something. We got to think about it differently. One of the things that I came across as I was talking to different organizations and my peers in other companies is, we love to create. We have an incident, let's create another procedure. We have a procedure, let's add more steps in this. Let's add more controls, let's add more safeguards. We had clutter before, we're adding more clutter into the system. We as leaders are not able to manage that clutter, and yet do we expect the frontline workers to be able to sift through them and understand. And one of the things as well, like as we go through this, Kate also mentioned, make mistakes, humans make mistakes. And we get into the human and organizational performance. Now this is a topic that's been around for decades, to be honest, but in the safety space, it's starting to show up more and more in the last 5 years. At least that's when I was introduced to this. We as humans make mistakes, always have, always will. Blame does not fix things. What blame does is transfer our responsibilities onto the worker. We don't take responsibility as leaders. And context matters. Context around why an incident happened, what happened, matters. Learning, obviously important. That's how we improve. And lastly, how leaders show up really matters. That is a really big topic. But how they show up in the field, how they talk, their words, it matters. Okay, we're going to focus on being human. We make mistakes, you make mistakes, I definitely make mistakes. I'm not as handy around the house, but I like watching YouTube videos. I will watch 1 or 2 or 3, I will think I got this, and then I go to do that thing, at home, and it's not always exactly the same. It's always something different. I try to improvise, and I sometimes, well, usually end up making things worse. So I make mistakes. It's not a high-risk task, so I don't hurt myself, except my ego, but it just goes to show how what we think on how a job should go doesn't always go according to plan. We start to realize that this notion of zero incidents is actually a fallacy. It contradicts with humans making mistakes. So we need to get over that, and that is difficult. That is a journey on its own. But as we realize that we will have incidents, what we want to do from them is to fail safely. We want to be able to not have a fatality or a serious injury from it. And as we start to get more and more comfortable with that understanding, you start to realize that safety is not just having zero incidents, but it's actually the capacity to fail safely. And that's what we want to focus on. And we need to understand that incidents can inevitably happen. We want to reduce them, and when they do happen, to allow them to fail safely. And it'll start to make a little bit more sense as we get into the three things that I talked about. So 3 terms. This is the first one, major accident hazards. We have hundreds of risks and threats at our job sites. Different job sites have different threats, but they're not all the same. We talked about slips, trips, and falls. We absolutely want to manage them. That's there in almost every organization that I go to. We want to make sure that we control it, but is it as critical as another task that can lead to a fatality? No. So you need more rigor around it. We have limited resources, limited time, limited people. So that's the focus. So we need to start understanding what those major accident hazards are. Now, the number one place where we go to look for them is our incident data. What has happened in the past can happen again. So that's pretty normal. But the one thing that we miss sometimes is asking the workers themselves. And not in a forum outside, but going into the field, talking to them either before they start the work or after they just finished the work, because things are fresh in their minds. They know what they were worried about. So you start to find out a lot more. They talk a lot. We as leaders need to find out what they're really concerned with. And as you start talking with more and more workers, you find out more and more. As we look at your major accident hazards, you start to see there's 2 types of controls that we want to focus on. One are preventative controls. That is the preventative controls that are trying to prevent the incident from happening in the first place. You're very important, want to make sure they're there. But the second, as important, are the recovery controls. That is when an incident has happened, inevitably, how can you recover from that so that you can fail safely? And we've had them in our systems in the past, but we just haven't had the rigor around it. The second thing, the first one was major hazards. The second one is critical controls that I want you to remember. We need to understand what are the critical controls that provide more value, more rigor, more checks to make sure that our major accident hazards are managed safely. And that will allow us to be able to deploy our resources at the right place, inevitably when you find gaps in it. The one thing as you start to identify critical controls, one thing, you have to tie them to a major accident hazard, not just any hazard. Because if you call critical controls for every hazard, or you call all controls critical, then nothing is critical. And that's something that we've gone, like I've noticed in the risk and safety space, we get uncomfortable with this. Because we want to obviously try and prevent all the incidents. We don't want to say, and we're not okay with incidents, but we have to start to understand that some of them are bigger than the others. And then the third thing I want you to remember is assurance on those critical controls. We have major accident hazards, we have critical controls to manage them. How do we know that we have the capacity to fail safely? How do we know that those critical controls are working? So that's where you do assurance on. Now, what is assurance? There's 2 things. One is verification. It's different than verification. If I'm the worker about to start a task, I'm going to verify that these controls are in place, right? Pre-job checklist, going to make sure, yeah, done. I can go and start the work. I can verify things by myself as a worker. Anybody who's been in audit and assurance, you cannot do an assurance on yourself. You need a third person to do that assurance on you or on your work. So what assurance is, supervisors in the field, while the work is happening, are going and conducting assurance on the critical controls to make sure they're in place effectively to protect the worker. The assurance is not the worker. It's on the controls that are there to protect the worker. And you start doing that, obviously targeted, making sure you're doing that on major accident hazards, where the work is happening. And then as you start to find gaps, you start to prioritize where to put in the effort to fix it right away. Now, some of the elements on what good looks like in the assurance space. We want to be able to do it on everything, but again, limited resources, we can't do it on everything. Our supervisors are busy, they have a very difficult task. They have to plan, they have to schedule, they have to look after all the workers, they're responsible for safety. We can't make this cumbersome for them. So make it easy to do so it doesn't impact all their other work. It becomes part of the work naturally. You start to develop checklists. I'm not talking pages long, I'm talking about 3 or 4 questions, key questions that you start to look at for each critical control. And as they start to find deficiencies in it, they can, again, without blame, start to work with the worker and start fixing them right then and there. Now, as we started on this journey, there's a saying that we say, embrace the red and challenge the green. So you start to look at the effectiveness of these controls, you do assurance on it, you start seeing some red in your data sheets or your reports. Embrace it. It's a good thing because we were blinded to that gap before we started doing assurance. This is the opportunity to fix. And if everything is coming back as green, I would start to question that as well. Are we filling it out properly? Are the questions even right? Right? So it's a constant effort to go through over and over again to make sure that we are asking the right things, checking the right things, and fixing the right things. I'd like us to go back now on what I started this talk with. We were all a bit uncomfortable asking our loved ones to do this high-risk task purely based on the procedure that we developed for them and walking away, right? We as leaders in this space owe the same level of uncomfortableness for all of our workers. We owe them the same level of safety. We say change starts with us. We have the opportunity in this room and in your networks to make that step change in our organizations so that every worker can go home and go home safely. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'll be around for a few hours after. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. But with that, I thank you.